What's up, marketers, and welcome to another episode of the Growth Colony podcast. I'm Liza from Xgrowth to tell you that each episode we bring in B2B leaders to chat about how you can achieve those everyday wins in the marketing world. Whether you're new to the B2B game, working at a leadership level, or even just showing some interest, we know you'll love the episode. So grab a drink, get comfy, and enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode. I'm Shane Hoda with Xgrowth, and today I'm talking to Aaron McEwan, Vice President for Research and Advisory at Gartner, about how AI is going to impact your role and what you should be looking at in the market, especially with all the buzz that is happening out there with AI, especially in the marketing space and sales space and HR space as well. There's a lot that is happening. So I'm super excited to speak to Aaron about his take and where does he see AI going. Aaron, thanks so much for jumping on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
Pleasure is all mine. I love to dive right in and get your thoughts on where we are at with AI. I know Gartner has the adoption curve, and everything that happens, every new thing goes on the adoption curve. First of all, what are your thoughts on, maybe for people who haven't seen or haven't heard of the adoption curve, can you tell a little bit about what adoption curve is and what are your thoughts are with regards to AI and the adoption curve?
Yeah, sure. And it's probably helpful to kind of define things a little bit more closely. The AI field, artificial intelligence, is massive. So there's lots going on. So I think the area that's probably best for us to focus on is generative AI. So I might just talk about the adoption curve.
Let's do that.
Yeah. You know, that's the kind of new kid on the block that's generated all of this hype and excitement. So Gartner has a particular methodology that we refer to as a Gartner hype cycle. And what we've found over years and years of research is that emerging technologies tend to follow a relatively predictive or predictable adoption curve. You know, there'll be a kind of innovation spark. So if we think back, almost a year ago when generative AI first kind of came on the scene, what happens is it tends to generate a lot of hype amongst a small group of early adopters. And that creates this innovation spark. Eventually, media sources pick up on it. It starts to get out there into the mainstream. And then very quickly, it will reach what we call the peak of inflated expectations. So that's kind of like, this is the most amazing thing since sliced bread. It's going to revolutionize the world. Industries will be toppled. And so once that technology is being spoken about on mainstream media and it's being shared, you can kind of get a sense that it's at that peak of inflated expectations. Now, it'll stay there for a little while. But eventually we start to realize that, maybe this thing is more expensive than we thought it was. Maybe it's more difficult to operationalize or to roll out across our organizations, for example. And then it starts to tip over and then kind of slide down this curve into what we call the trough of disillusionment, which is when the kind of the bubble bursts in terms of the hype. And that's when we realize this thing doesn't do everything that we thought it could do, but it doesn't stay there for long. Eventually, it will make its way out of that and move into what we call the plateau of productivity. So this is when we've kind of ironed the bugs out. We've found the applications that this new technology is going to best support. It starts to become embedded into organizations and our day-to-day lives. And that's when it really reaches its kind of mainstream, where it's not super hyped, but it's just part of how we go about doing business now. So there's a pretty good indication that generative AI is just starting to slide down that trough of disillusionment. Organizations certainly are finding that it's probably way more expensive than they had anticipated. It doesn't do quite everything that it's promised, and it's certainly proving difficult to embed in organizations at scale. CEOs have invested a lot of money into this technology, and they were quite bullish on it returning all sorts of productivity gains for their organizations. now those CEOs are really looking for, well, what is the return on investment for all of that money, time, energy, et cetera, that we've been pumping into this? So we've seen that kind of reflected in the share market. There's been quite a shaky period over the last couple of weeks. And I think a lot of that can be contributed to this second guessing of all of this investment in generative AI.
Interesting. So we are just sliding down in that on the curve. When it comes to roles and responsibilities and the work that people are doing, as you're looking at potentially us going through the downturn of Gen AI and then coming out of it, what are your thoughts in terms of what kind of roles are going to be most impacted by Gen AI?
Well, the short answer to this is that almost every role will be impacted by this technology. And that's what we tend to find in terms of emerging technologies and their impact on jobs and skills. So historically, and certainly when we were at that kind of peak of inflated expectations, it also came with a lot of fear. So many employees are worried about losing their jobs. In my more cynical moments, I think I could say that a lot of CEOs were counting on that, the displacement of workers. And that's where a lot of that productivity gain was expected to come from. But historically, whenever we look at emerging technologies, they tend to, over time, be a net creator of jobs. But the type of technologies like generative AI are likely to impact and change almost everybody's jobs and the work that they do. So it'll create demands for new types of capabilities. We can expect it to create entirely new classifications of jobs, for example. So I would expect that every worker should be looking at, how is this technology potentially changing the way that I work? The good news is that some jobs probably will be displaced entirely, but it tends not to be many jobs that are displaced entirely. So there's certain segments, I think, of industries, the creative industries, things like design are likely to be impacted quite significantly. But one of the things that this type of technology has a tendency to do is that it pushes work up the complexity bar. So
what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so it can take over some of the more repeatable components of work. But what it often does is that as we get rid of those components and automate them, it creates even more complex work.
Right.
So, there's a few examples that I can share with you that
let's I'm very keen to hear.
Yeah. So, one example might be, and we do see this in terms of existing technologies within the insurance industry, for example. So let's say you have an inbound call center. So increasingly, the role of those inbound call centers is to take inquiries from clients. And they might be calling in to do all sorts of things like change their address details or change their policies, obviously submitting, applications, for example. So today, a lot of that work is done by a combination of chatbots and web forms. And so the calls that actual human beings take are often the more complex inquiries. So put this in the context of ongoing climate change. So that means more natural disasters. So the human being that's sitting on the end of a telephone for an insurance company, they're more likely to receive a call from somebody who's in distress. So it won't be calling to say, hey, I need to update my address details. It will be, I've just lost my house in a natural disaster, a flood or something like that. It may be that they've lost loved ones or pets. And so you can kind of see there that even though the chatbots and the web forms have taken over that more repeatable, simple tasks, the tasks that are left are much more cognitively challenging and emotionally complex. And that requires a higher order of skill set. So this is often the impact that emerging technologies have on jobs, is that it pushes the work up that complexity bar, and it actually makes that job kind of harder, ironically, not necessarily easier.
Yeah, great point. Aaron, I want to go back to a point that you made earlier where you were talking about this is potentially going to create new jobs and new responsibilities. What have you seen so far being created? Have you seen new titles and new job descriptions coming out that is really centered around this? Is that something that you've started to observe, or not just yet?
To a degree. I think the word that pulls all of this together is hype, right? So these types of things generate a lot of hype, and you do see that hype reflected in the emergence of new shiny job titles that are kind of specifically designed.
What are the best ones you've heard?
I don't know if there's anything kind of freaky about any of these, but they're typically the kind of chief AI officer.
Yeah.
That's kind of predictable, right? And so I do think we will see more of that over time. I think the most obvious one that has popped up is prompt engineer. That's kind of central to getting the most out of these technologies. But, I can envisage quite quickly that we won't need prompt engineers in the very near future, because even that component of utilizing that technology is likely to be increasingly automated and built into systems that allow people to adopt a particular persona, for example, and the system will generate relevant prompts. So that technology already exists. It might not be being utilized widely, but it already is. So yeah, that's a kind of an example of an emerging job that didn't exist 12 months ago. But it exists.
But I like how you have this observation that it might go away. I feel like prompt engineers today, it's like if you turn to someone today and say, "Oh, this is a Googling engineer," and they've mastered how to Google things and they can help you with Googling. Where maybe in a couple of years' time, that's where we're going to be with prompt engineers, and be like, we had prompt engineers and a very quick transition. But I mean, it might stay. But
couldn't agree more. I mean, none of us are sitting around contemplating what happened to all the Boolean search engineers, right?
That's right. That's very true. Very true. Very good point. Okay, so one of the things that a lot of our listeners is on their mind is, a lot of our listeners are either in B2B marketing or B2B growth and focused on revenue. What are your thoughts in terms of Gen AI and revenue generation? How does that Venn diagram look like from your perspective?
Well, it depends on where the revenue is being generated. So I think, again, if I go back to the hype, I think at the moment there's a lot of hype around the possibility of automating client interactions, particularly at the sales perspective. So things like prospecting. And, there's multitudes of applications available now that can help you automate, outreach emails, for example, that go out and help you with prospecting. I think the thing that worries me, and this is something that worries me in general about generative AI. I used to be a musician, so I'm fascinated about the way in which this technology is potentially being used to create music. Unfortunately, the way I describe it today is that it's really cool to be able to, kind of take your favorite song or favorite genre and get AI to perform it from a completely different artist or a completely different genre. That's kind of cool and interesting, but am I going to buy that album? I don't think so, right? And so I think there's this kind of, it's interesting, the outputs. So the outputs of AI today, as it might be used in B2B, for example, it's kind of interesting. It promises this great productivity gain or cost saving, and potentially being able to generate revenue faster because you can do these outreach emails
scale.
At scale. Yeah, exactly. So I think the promise is exciting, but I worry about the eventual mediocrity of it. So I'm sure you've experienced on platforms like LinkedIn, for example, the kind of disappointing AI generated responses. What's even more, I think, disheartening is the disappointingly created AI created articles. So it's almost like today you can kind of tell because it lacks a certain depth or creativity. So when the world is flooded with prospecting outreach, or my inbox is flooded with it, it's going to take something special to make that stand out from the crowd. And at the moment, I'm not sure that generative AI is good at making something stand out from the crowd in a substantive way. It's just creating a more crowded space.
One of the things that you and I have spoken before is we spoke about the augmentation of decision making with AI and Gen AI. Can we unpack that a little bit? Because I thought that was fascinating.
I guess this comes from a lot of the fears about job losses. So I get asked repeatedly, which roles are likely to be most impacted by AI or generative AI. And I think people kind of expect it to be, artists and creative designers and architects. And I think, yes, those types of jobs will be impacted. But there's a type of job that nobody's really talking about, which I actually think is highly likely to be impacted substantially by these tools. And now we're talking about not just generative AI, but AI more broadly. And one of those is, chief executive officers. So CEOs, executive teams, and potentially even boards of directors. And the reason that I say that is that I think one of the effective uses of AI is around decision making. So human beings are fallible. We are kind of at risk of falling into all sorts of cognitive distortions and traps, whether it's the kind of, the irony of sharing this as we talk about the hype cycle, for example, is not lost on me. But there's the sunk loss fallacy. So once you dump a bunch of money into something, you tend to stick with it for longer and you don't pull out because you've committed so much already. And there's all sorts of other cognitive distortions that we're at risk of falling into. And so when you're thinking about, looking after the interests of shareholders, you have to make really sound decisions. AI and generative AI is already quite good at helping us develop strategy or to generate scenarios in scenario planning to help us think through multiple variables. So from a strategic planning perspective, I can absolutely see that more and more organizations will engage these types of technologies to help them build their strategies, test their strategies, measure their strategies, for example. So that in itself is a form of augmented decision-making, if it makes sense. But I also think that one of the huge opportunities is, for example, having an AI agent in the boardroom as executives make important decisions to ensure that they're not falling into these very human cognitive traps.
Aaron, are there practical examples that you can think of? Because this sounds like something from, it right now it doesn't feel tangible, right? Are there tools that you have seen maybe at an individual level, right? Because not everybody who's listening to this is going to be a chief executive, but from a decision-making perspective, because the AI needs a lot of context and needs, a fair bit of information about the situation and so on and so forth. Have you seen this maybe at a smaller scale being done? I had a chat with somebody the other day, and he was talking about how I unfortunately didn't get a chance to dive a little bit deeper, but how he uses Perplexity for decision making and going back and forth. Practically, have you seen whether it's a tool or somebody using some of the AI platforms that are readily available, like ChatGPT or Perplexity or Claude or whoever it is, to kind of do that or incorporate that in their own day-to-day or maybe work professional decision making?
Yeah, absolutely. There's an expert, a fantastic AI expert called Ross Dawson, and he's developed, and I know I'm going to get the name of this wrong because I always think it's called Dreamweaver, but it's not. But essentially, it's an application that it's like a plugin that allows you to use ChatGPT, for example, but you can use this technology to create prompts from different personas' perspectives. So this is an example of kind of going, I want to get an entirely different perspective on a problem that I'm trying to solve. So I want ChatGPT to answer this question or solve this problem from the perspective of a persona that thinks completely differently to me. Maybe it's the nutty professor, or maybe it's the the management consultant. So you can already use these tools to get different perspectives from a more diverse, I guess, a diverse range of thinking styles, for example. So I think that, that's one application of it. Another really interesting application, which is live, I'm not going to say that everyone's got access to this, but I think it was, and I hope I've got this correct, but I think it was Reed Hastings, who essentially got an AI to consume everything that he has published, spoken about in the media, for example, and essentially plugged that into the system to create an artificial version of himself, right? An avatar. And what he was able to do was interview himself.
That's crazy.
And so again, when you're thinking about making wise decisions, having the ability to see that problem from multiple perspectives and very diverse perspectives, it's kind of interesting. The research on wisdom kind of shows that, if you don't have it by about 35, you probably won't get it. So it's not necessarily a how long have you been on the planet for, but really the pathway to wisdom is being able to see problems from multiple perspectives. And the higher that perspective is, so, at the most basic level, it's like a cost-benefit analysis. It's like, what's in it for me, right? Then you can go up through the layers like an onion. And the next layer might be, what's in the best interest of the team that I work for? Next layer would be best interest of my company. Next layer, industry. Next layer might be the nation. And you keep going up, till eventually you kind of get what's the best thing for the world? What's the best thing for the planet? And that's really what wisdom is, right? And so being able to tap into multiple perspectives and think about a problem, or think about, this is my response to that problem, and have that tested in ways that help you gain more and more perspective. And it's interesting because this is essentially what we hire executives for, is that they come with, presumably high levels of cognitive intelligence. They're able to see the world from multiple perspectives. They bring experience to play, and they bring, ultimately what I think many organizations look for when they hire a chief executive officer or CEO, is that they need to make decisions quickly that are in the best interests of the company, its workforce, its shareholders, and other stakeholders. And they need to do that under pressure and to do it quickly. So these emerging AI tools have the potential to really help with that and take away a lot of the risk, right? Because not every CEO makes good decisions. And we see that played out time and time again, whether it's a kind of scandal that they find themselves in, where they've behaved poorly or they've used the wrong choice of words, whether they haven't engaged their investor community effectively. It's very difficult to please all of the people all of the time. And so these tools are going to help. I think one of the more interesting applications of them will be how it's used to augment decision-making at the highest levels of organizations. But we can do that today, to your point, at the ground. There are tools that will help us see things from multiple perspectives and make better decisions in our own lives.
And we're gonna dig up some of these links and put them in the show notes. Aaron, what are your thoughts on skill development? Right. So if somebody's listening to this and they're like, I really need to get on top of my game when it comes to AI or generative AI or LLMs or whatever it is, what would be your recommendation to them to start to upskill in this space?
I think the first and most important thing is be curious. So we can kind of wrap all of this up into a concept or a terminology that at Gartner we refer to as digital dexterity. So one of the most important skill sets for the future is digital dexterity. And what that is it's essentially being comfortable with working with emerging technology. So the first thing is to be curious about that. And something I used to kind of think about a lot was I used to think, when did my grandparents stop buying new clothes? Right? Or when did they stop listening to new music? And it's almost like you can see a point in time where a person has just gone, nah, that's enough for me. I'm sticking to what I know, and I'm no longer kind of leaning into what is new. So that's the first thing that I would encourage people to do is don't be scared of this stuff. Lean into it. Be curious about it. That could just be reading about it. It could just be go and download one of the versions of generative AI and just start using it. I remember when it first came out, the first question that I put into ChatGPT was, how is this technology going to impact jobs in the future? Because that's what I was curious about. That was kind of my job to know that. And I was pretty astounded by the quality of answer I got to that first initial question. But the next thing that I used it for was I have a son who is autistic, and he had to present a little, talk at school. And so you can imagine, he's filled with anxiety about it. He struggles with communicating. So this was a really scary prospect to stand up in front of his class and do a talk. So we sat down together and went, let's see what ChatGPT can come up with. So, we punched in a few prompts around, generate a 5-minute talk on this topic. We asked it to inject some jokes into it because, he responds really positively if you can get the room to laugh with him. What came out wasn't perfect. The jokes were pretty crappy, to be honest. But it gave him this kind of incredible starting point, and you could see the light of curiosity light up. So now I'm just constantly getting requests through my phone from my son looking for permission to download whatever the latest, AI application that's being released, right, that is. So I think that's a really good lesson to take, which is find a real problem. Could be in your work, could be in your personal life, and just start engaging with that technology. And that can lead you to all sorts of places. The next practical thing I'd say is go find a course. I mentioned Ross Dawson. I've just completed a course that he runs on augmented decision-making, which was a particular area that I was interested in. And I found that hugely valuable. So there's lots of different courses out there that people can do. Some of those are an hour. Others that might take place over a 6-week period.
That's
curiosity is the key to this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, augmented decision making as a course sounds pretty badass. But no, that's those are great recommendations. And probably the last question that I have, and it's a great segue to what you were talking about. I was going to ask you, how are you using AI platforms today for yourself personally? Obviously, the example of what you did with your son is an awesome example. Is there anything else that you can think of that is now has become, either it's a pretty big part of how you go about your day, or it's really on your radar and you're like, this could be very interesting?
Yeah, and there's kind of two parts to this story, which is where the trough of disillusionment comes in. So I think on the exciting positive side, I've found the tools particularly helpful. If you think about my kind of day-to-day job is speaking with executives, and typically those are, chief HR officers, about things like the future of work and all of the types of topics that we've been talking about today. So quite often I'll find myself knowing that I've got a call coming up with a CHRO that I've not spoken before, may not be familiar with their company, sometimes not even their industry. And so these tools are really helpful to just do a really quick search on what's going on with this company or that person, for example, to get, it just goes beyond typical Google search. And you're able to find out, what are the top 10 challenges for this organization, for example. So that type of preparation, I've found the tool particularly helpful for. It's really good for summarizing meetings, summarizing conversations. So, rather than having to listen back to a recording that might take an hour, deploying AI to summarize the key points is really, really powerful. I find it particularly helpful to get me started. I'm a classic procrastinator. And what I've learned over time is that I procrastinate when I don't know how to start. And so for me, generative AI gives me starting points, whether that's an article that I'm trying to write or some type of response to a question, for example. And I do use it to help get those different perspectives. I know I have blind spots. I know I have my own biases. I can see the world in a particular way. So I do like to get occasionally, I'd love to say I do this all the time, but I don't, to get those different perspectives and to help me see a problem or the world from a different perspective. Now to the kind of downside, and this is the trough of disillusionment that we're starting to fall into, which is I have found that for more complex tasks, where I might have a degree of unconscious competence because I've been doing it for years and years and years and years, it actually slows me down. So when I use it, it actually takes longer to get to a conclusion that I had already kind of made. So I think that's the area where the technology, will improve over time. But at the moment, and this seems to be reflected in the limited research that's been done on the impact of generative AI on worker productivity, for example. So there's a couple of interesting lessons in this one. The first one is that it tends to take people who are less experienced at a particular task, and it can accelerate their time to productivity or competence, for example. But for people who are very experienced and highly skilled in that particular task, it doesn't seem to add much in terms of value at this point, right? And then, sometimes we over-engineer things as well. So I think, some of the research, particularly done by Microsoft, has found that, the kind of power users of AI can generate about a 15% productivity improvement per day. My response to that is, so could canceling a meeting, so there are some simple things we could do to get that productivity gain. And I think, some of the more kind of entrenched problems with work is not about getting smarter or getting more intelligent. It's actually about focusing on the things that matter and getting rid of the clutter. Our worlds of work are just cluttered. They're full of unnecessary things. And it's a story I often tell, which is, I guess, a cautionary tale. I mentioned that I was a musician. So this was back, we started our band back when I was in university. And there was a bunch of us that were, we just graduated our undergrad. We were moving into postgrad and we were selecting our master's degrees. I went into a master's of clinical psych, as did our guitarist. But our bass player, even though he graduated out of psych, decided that he was going to do this brand new master's program. And it was a master's in leisure studies. So this is back in the 90s. And this master's came about because people had sat down and gone, all of these amazing technologies that are coming are just going to save us so much time that we're going to need professionals to help us understand what to do with our leisure.
Boy.
Yeah. And here we are, 25, 30 years later, working longer and harder than we ever have. So what tends to happen, to kind of come full circle with these technologies is they do take over smaller, repeatable tasks, and they chip away at that and they remove them from people's jobs. And that creates a vacuum. And what do we fill that vacuum with? More work,
more stuff,
often harder work, but more likely just more meetings and more messing around and doing things that don't drive productivity. So I think,
that's a great answer.
Yeah. In terms of the future, the thing that's going to matter the most is having the time and cognitive space to solve really big problems. And you can't do that when you're just busy.
Yeah, very true.
Busy work.
Very true.
Yeah.
Very
and
true.
My great hope is that the AI tools that we each start to kind of deploy into our own working lives will actually help us plan our time so that we can get into deep work and we can do it super effectively. It'll help us kind of think through those different perspectives. It will nudge us when we're falling into a cognitive trap, but it might also start to manage our calendars and our diaries in such a way that we're actually super effective. at what we do. And that's going to be preventing pointless work from filling our time up.
Aaron, this has been an awesome conversation. Before we wrap up, I got a couple of rapid fire questions. We can do one or two short answers to each of them. Ready to go?
I think so.
All right, let's do it. First question. What is one resource that you maybe in the past 3 or 6 months you've come across that you were very impressed with or had a big impact on you? It could be a book, a blog, a podcast, whatever it is.
This is gonna sound weird, but it's actually a book called World War Z.
Right.
And it's a fiction book. It was turned into a movie that.
Oh yes, that's right. Right.
It doesn't resemble the book in any way. But the reason that I found this so insightful is that there's a little kind of subplot that involves, for example, Israel being the only country in the world that had a plan for the zombie apocalypse. And the reason that they had a plan was that as part of their national defense strategy, there was a group of people whose sole job was to examine all possible scenarios. But one member of that group was tasked with having a solution for the most unlikely scenario. That actually changed the way I think about the future of work, the way I think about, for example, I was heavily involved in Gartner's response to the pandemic. That kind of changed my perspective significantly. And I now look at this type of strategic planning in a very, very different way.
Love that. Sometimes insights from novels and non-fiction work could be very, very impactful. Question number 2 is, if you could give one piece of advice to B2B marketers, what would it be? Be
targeted, be genuine, don't fall into being just part of the mediocrity.
Love that. I love that. There's a lot of that coming, I feel. But question 3 is, who are some of the influencers? You've already mentioned a couple. Who are some of the influencers in this space, in the Gen AI and the AI space that you very closely follow?
Oh, there's so many, but I think Ross Dawson is absolutely somebody that I follow. Gartner's chief of research is also somebody that I would absolutely recommend following. So you can actually find his updates on generative AI on a regular basis. He produces videos on a very regular basis. And that pulls together all of the cumulative wisdom from Gartner's experts that are working in all parts of, whether it's the technology through to the impact on work, through to the impact on, augmented decision-making, et cetera, et cetera. Chris Howard,
Aaron,
by the way.
Chris Howard, thank you very much for that. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was an awesome conversation. And
cool.
I definitely have a fefew things that I've written down that I'm going to be going and checking. I'm definitely going to be checking that course, augmented decision making, that's for sure. But
I think it might be called human plus AI decision making.
I see. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And thank you for your time and all the insights that you shared.
Yeah, no worries.
Today's episode of Growth Colony was produced by Alexander Hipwell and Liza Maywald. It was edited by Dave Samito with additional editing by Liza Maywald and music arrangement by Alexander and Liza. Special thanks to Tina Wabe. We couldn't make the show without you. Growth Colony is hosted by Shaheen Hoda, Director of Growth at Xgrowth. If you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Do you think you'd be a great guest or just keen for a chat? Send through an email at podcast@xgrowth.com.au. That's podcast@xgrowth.com.au. That's all for now. We'll catch you next week, right here on Growth Colony.